Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'm going to be covering the weather for June 15th of 2023. Currently there's a moderate threat issued for parts of western Oklahoma into parts of northern Texas and southern Kansas, as well as a pretty large enhanced risk around that into parts of north central Texas and parts of southern Kansas, as well as a slight risk which extends all the way into the Atlantic Ocean, all the way into the majority of southwestern Kansas, into parts of eastern Colorado and into much of northern or eastern Texas, into the Gulf of Mexico as well. However, I do think that the slight risk down here is a little bit of ongoing convection left over from the day prior as a possible derecho moving into the Gulf of Mexico or northern Florida. But however, I am mostly going to focus on today's moderate threat. We also do have a little bit of a marginal threat from northern Ohio into parts of Detroit and Michigan. As for our tornado threats, we do have a 10% tornado threat for that western Oklahoma area into parts of the Texas Panhandle, as well as a 5% around that into northern Texas, as well as into parts of southwestern Kansas. We do have a 2% that does connect to another 5% for the Gulf Coast in southern Alabama, parts of southern Mississippi, parts of southern Georgia, and the Florida Panhandle. I, again, likely won't cover this 5% at all in today's forecast, as I have a much bigger thing at risk right here. As for our wind threats, we do have a 45% on top of a 30%, on top of a 15% that connects down to the slight risk down towards the derecho further down south. This has the possibility of wind gusts up to 70 knots or higher. This is going to be extremely strong and destructive outflow gusts in much of the Oklahoma, northern Texas area, and southwestern Kansas area. This is going to be extremely strong. Again, possibility of wind gusts up to 70 knots or higher with this hatch significant threat in question. As for our hail threats, we do have a 45% on top of a 30%, which is definitely an increase from the moderate threat that was down in the southern Dixie Alley area. This does have a hatch significant threat on top of it, so we could possibly see hailstones up to 2 inches to possibly even 4 inches, and maybe even higher in this area in particular. We do have another hatch significant threat for the Gulf Coast area in the Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida Panhandle area. As for the marginal threat that's back towards northern Ohio and Detroit region, we do have that, again, that marginal threat, which doesn't have a tornado threat, but it does have a 5% wind threat and a 5% hail threat. Taking a look at the pivotal weather model, starting off with our 500 millibars and our triggers for our severe weather development for today, we do have that impulse that did trigger severe weather development left over in Dixie Alley, and as this decreases and makes its way out into the Atlantic Ocean, it shouldn't be all that much of a threat to the United States anymore. But then we do have this impulse back towards the moderate threat area in the subtropical jet, which should trigger severe weather development in Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. Not only is this going to be our main trigger for our severe weather development, this is also going to trigger some very strong wind shear, as well as allow for the possibility of our tornadoes, and as well as the possibility of some extremely large hail. Taking a look at our 700 millibars, you can still see that shortwave trough in that embedded long wave subtropical jet that is still making its way through the Dixie Alley area that did aid in severe weather development the day prior through Dixie Valley with that moderate threat. But as that makes its way out of the United States, it shouldn't really be, again, as all that much of a threat. But then we do have a kind of weaker embedded shortwave trough making its way along the subtropical jet to help aid with severe weather development. Not only will this aid in our severe weather development a little bit, but it should also aid it in our wind shear as well. Taking a look at our dew points, we don't really have all that very strong, extreme amounts of humidity that we were seeing like down in Dixie Alley the other day or in Texas the last week. We do have some more subtle dew points in the areas that's going to be affected by this moderate threat. However, dew points in the 60s, the low 60s to the upper 60s, and possibly the low 70s in some very small isolated regions will definitely allow for the possibility of some strong instability depending on our lapse rates areas. But then you can also see this dry line that is expected to develop through the Texas Panhandle. This should aid in not only triggering severe weather development, but if there is a warm boundary, which I will show you guys on our temperatures in a little bit, this should aid in a little bit of our triple point and focus our severe weather development to one particular region before it moves eastward. You can see in northern Texas how we do have some much stronger amounts of humidity. Depending on our lapse rates, we could definitely see some extremely strong amounts of instability, again depending on our lapse rates, but if any cells manage to move through this area with wind shear in place, we could possibly see a tornado threat with any cells that move through northern Texas. There was a 5% for the northern Texas region, so with some decently strong wind shear as well as some extremely strong instability and humidity, depending on our lapse rates, we could possibly see some tornadic development in northern Texas as well. Taking a look at our lapse rates, you can already see that we have some extremely strong lapse rates that are expected to move through the area right before storm development time. In western Oklahoma, you can see that we have lapse rates in the mid to upper 8s and possibly the low 9s in some isolated regions, as well as for the Texas Panhandle as well. We have some extremely strong lapse rates as well. They're kind of the same thing in western Texas in the mid to upper 8s and possibly the low 9s as well. With whatever moisture we have, that is going to allow for the possibility with those dew points in the 60s to possibly see some CAPE values in the 3000s. And then taking a look at northern Texas with that extremely strong amount of humidity, these lapse rates are definitely going to allow for the possibility of some really strong instability, possibly CAPE values that reach the 4000s in widespread regions. Taking a look at our instability, let's start off with where we could possibly see that 10% tornado threat. We have some fairly strong instability across the Texas Panhandle, where storm development is expected to begin across the Texas Panhandle as it moves eastward. We see some extremely strong instability in the 3000s and possibly the upper 3000s, maybe even the low 4000s in some isolated regions, but because of how small the 4000s are in those isolated regions, it may not be likely. But then looking at northern Texas, we have some extremely strong instability, widespread 4000s, possibly the 5000s in some regions, maybe even up to the upper 5000s in some regions, and even displaying the low 6000s in some regions. If any supercells move through this area, they are going to absolutely explode with whatever wind shear we have. They could definitely have the possibility of creating tornadoes. That's not the only threat with instability like this. We could definitely see the possibility of some extremely strong outflow gusts, as well as the possibility of some very, very large hail and large amounts of hail as well as some very strong damaging outflow gusts. However, overall, with this extremely strong instability back in the Texas Panhandle, this will definitely be sufficient enough with whatever wind shear we have for that 10% tornado threat. Taking a look at our wind shear, let's go to around storm development time when strong supercells begin to develop. You can see that line of supercells are expected to be somewhere right here along that line there. That's going to be, again, where supercells are expected to develop, and you can see all this very strong wind shear ahead of those supercells. As they continue eastward, they're not only going to move through strong to moderate instability, but also extremely strong wind shear. Wind shear in the 50 knots or higher is definitely going to be sufficient enough for multiple tornadoes today as these supercells continue to move eastward. And you can see with that extremely strong amount of wind shear, it is expected to grow as supercells develop and continue eastward, possibly even the 80 knots in some regions. That is insane. That is definitely going to allow for that 10% tornado threat. And where we see that extremely strong amounts of instability in northern Texas, we also have some extremely strong amounts of wind shear as well. So any supercells that either develop or move through this area are definitely going to have the good chance of developing tornadoes, as well as the possibility of some very, very large hail. And then again, with this wind shear and that very strong mid-level flow, we could definitely see, again, possibility of hail up to 2 inches to 4 inches or maybe even larger. Taking a look at our temperatures here, I am going to look at our temperatures because keep in mind the dry line that is expected to develop somewhere in the central Texas Panhandle, close to the Oklahoma border. You can see right around as intense day heating starts up, you can see a strong boundary between extremely hot temperatures and again extremely hot temperatures in not only northern central Texas, but then the rest of the central plains. But you can definitely see a fine line between temperatures that are much higher and temperatures that are still really high, but not as high as further down south. You can see that boundary somewhere around right here with that dry line that develops somewhere right here. A triple point is expected to develop somewhere in Texas right here. That is going to be the main focus of where storm development is going to initiate for today, and again, where storms are most likely going to develop first. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator or this extremely strong severe weather threat. If you live in any of the areas that I covered for today, make sure you are weather alert for any warnings, and hopefully I will be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.